Hey, good to be with you today. I'm Scott, and just grateful to have this time together to remind ourselves of the things that we're thinking about here in this hour together. John O'Donohue says this. He says, once the soul awakens, referring to these realities, these truths that we're talking about together as God's people, the search begins and you can never go back. From then on, you are inflamed with a special longing that will never again let you linger in the lowlands of complacency and partial fulfillment. And yes, I agree with you, that would have sounded better with an English accent, or an Irish accent rather, like if I could have sparked that up for you. But his words, his words, the lowlands of complacency and partial fulfillment is probably like, yeah, I don't know much about Irish poetry, but I know that. I know what it's like to pay a lot for a vacation and then be like, that was like mid. That was like okay. I know what it's like to reach the pinnacle of something and go like, everyone thinks I should be really excited, but I'm like, kind of not. Like, why? Like, what's that? Like the tension of the ignition in our soul towards being made for more in the lowlands of complacency and partial fulfillment is how a lot of us live our lives. And then there's this other complicating factor that I'll illustrate this way, which is this reality of just not just that tension, but then how that tension often is expressed is in the lives of the people around us, trying to vie for their journey out of those lowlands. So there's this Italian art exhibit that was set to open. It was a collab between two famous Italian artists. The art museum was really excited about it. And it was, the collaborative piece was a reflection on the hedonism and the consumption of the 1980s. I don't know if you grew up in the 80s, but their reflection of the 1980s wasn't just Stranger Things. It was the consumption and the hedonism of the time. And so they built this art onto the wall, kind of the conventional art museum thing that you would expect. But then they did something a little bit more than that. They opened the exhibit. It was very well received. You can see a picture of it here. There was one problem, though. The problem was no one told the cleaning crew that there wasn't just like an opening night rager to celebrate the opening of this art museum exhibit, that these cigarette butts and these champagne bottles were a reflection of the decadence of the 80s, not just the decadence of an opening of an art museum exhibit. So the cleaning crew came in that night and we're like, okay, there's paintings on the wall, but there's all this stuff on the floor. They cleaned it up. They even put it in the proper like rubbish and recycling bins. Like the next morning, everyone came in for day 2 and it was like a nice, pristine, clean floor. The cleaning crew hadn't been alerted to the nature of the art, which is probably a word for us in this tension of the lowlands of complacency and partial fulfillment, right? That there's some of us who by living what it means to be human, know what it's like to feel a bit discarded. We don't feel like an art exhibition. We don't feel like God's handiwork. We don't feel like God's masterpiece. We feel like something that maybe isn't so neatly like chucked into a rubbish bin. And if we're honest, like we've been guilty of this too. Like we've gone about our business and we've tried to find meaning and we've tried to find life, and it's very likely that we have othered, pushed people to the side and made them feel lesser than. And so this beautiful invitation from Ephesians to live as people made for more, to live in the spirit of God's grace, lands in these default settings of what it means to be human in 2025. Paul's words speak to first century artisans in Ephesus who make things for a living. Like the whole trade and economy of Ephesus is predicated on what people in that city can do with silver. They are artisans, they are craftsmen. It's a cosmopolitan city for a first century city, that is. It's an important trade route. People are figuring out how to get ahead. And Paul's words are like, you were made for more. But here's the deal, like your made for moreness isn't just like rooted in how impressive your resume is. It's the grace and mercy of Jesus speaking into your story. You are not just what you can do with your hands. You are not just your ability to do good works to a community. You understanding, though, that you are the handiwork of Jesus is like the building blocks of how we might actually do those good works well. In fact, like the interesting thing about the Ephesian church is that they're very socially respectable. They do good things for the poor. They're kind to the community. But they have this tendency, we learn this in Revelation 2 about them, to kind of lose the why behind all of that what. Does that happen to you? To lose the why, like why are we busy doing all of these activities? Why are we busy running to this thing and this thing and this thing? Why are we lingering in the lowlands of complacency and partial fulfillment? We lose sight of our first love. And that is the ignition of Ephesians 2, 8 through 10. Remember the grace and mercy of Jesus in your story. That when you discarded other people, when you were discarded, when you did the right things for the wrong reasons, when you did the wrong things, the love of God has still moved toward you. And there's some of us in this room, I had a really refreshing conversation with someone in the first hour about this actually, that we have reduced Christianity to behaviors, to following rules, to doing good things for the poor. Those are important, to be sure, but they're secondary to what's all this about to begin with? That while we were still sinners, while we were still a long way off, the love of God moved towards us. We've been talking about that for a few weeks now as a church. This passage is a fresh reminder of the things we spent time talking about in the Prodigal series. That the love of God moved towards us. When we were pretty full of ourselves and into our resume, the love of God says, hey, don't miss the feast. That's language from the past couple of weeks. There is this other kind of check to our default setting, though, right? That like if we think about this through the lens of social media, every social media kind of site has its own like for you section. What do I mean by that? Well, what TikTok means or what Instagram means is that like, oh, you like these videos, so let me give you like a deluge of other things based on the things that you already like that we're going to predict you will also like. And if you're a middle-aged man from Baltimore like I am, it'll be a bunch of snark about the Ravens not stopping the run. And it will be a bunch of stuff about middle-aged man things like beer belly and snoring. And then some hot takes from the moment with which we live. Like, it's predicting for me, like, hey, I know the kind of person you are and the kind of person you want to continue to become, so let me help you with this. This passage speaks to not just like, oh, you did some naughty things this week. God's grace and mercy is for you. Hey, you did some really great things this week. God's grace and mercy is for you. No, it speaks to something more comprehensive. It speaks to, hey, those voices in your head that are saying you should be here by now. You should be at this level by now. Those pressures to achieve and arrive. Has the love of God invaded those spaces? Or are we living by the law of the algorithm or by what our parents or by our job is kind of telling us is the way to find life? What Paul is introducing to the Ephesian church is a change of the operating system, to turn it on its head, to operate out of God's approval for us, which isn't based on our resume, but based on God's grace and willingness to move near, based on God's character, based on the thing God sees in us that we often don't see in ourselves or each other. And then to let that be our operating system for how we operate out, right? The core kind of question of this series will be, are we operating in our life out of God's approval Or are we busy doing things that sort of land us in a place of operating for approval? I'm okay if. And to pay attention to to those answers on the surface, but also below the surface. Like my friend Jay calls them the shoulds. Like he has been helpful for me. We've been helpful to each other of going, hey man, are you stuck in the shoulds? Right? I'll say it this way. Like A.W. Tozer has this list of self-reflections of like, hey, if you want to know if you're trapped living for other things, like living for lesser things, ask yourself what you want most, what you think about most, how you use your money, what you do with your leisure time, the company you enjoy, what we admire, what we laugh at. I think on a surface level, that can be great devotional fodder, right? What am I paying attention to? Like, what am I reacting to? But I think Jay's question to me, and then after good time together as friends, my question back to him is like those shoulds, or what are you living according to the shoulds, is speaking to where are you feeling the pressure below the surface to not operate out of being God's handiwork, to not operate out of being the living into God's grace, but reacting to pressures that are external, but still powerful in trying to form you. That canvas and clay song that Katie led for us, right? It gives the idea of the potter and clay, which is an Old Testament image of what it means to, I think, be part of God's handiwork, to trust the formation of God in our story over the other pressures, the other shoulds that are forming us. From the country we live in, from the party that we identify with, to the place that we live, to the season of life and where we think we should be in relation to other people. To let the love of God give us a more just and generous expression of who we actually are. And then rather than just consuming all of that and feeling either a great deal of pride that we're farther ahead than everyone else, or a great deal of shame and despair because we should be further along than we are, letting the love of God speak to that some of the best ways that God is going to work in Ephesus, some of the best ways God is going to work if we were to continue to read the book of Ephesus is how these group of people coming together, following Jesus, how they contribute to living for God's kingdom with how they utilize the resources that have been entrusted to them, how they operate, how they live their lives. Right? Not just consuming life in Ephesus, but going, hey, because of who I am in Jesus, because of what God is doing in our community, I will live from a differentiated place, and these things that are happening in my life and in my story, they become part of the ways in which God will do the work of unwinding what's been done in Ephesus. In fact, there's a whole thing that happens, it's recorded in the book of Acts, where there's a riot in the city because the economy of the city has been so disrupted by the way followers of Jesus have walked away from some of the ways in which life and economy in Ephesus is supposed to work. It's kind of a crazy moment. I want to jump to the Gospel of John for a moment. And I want to do that because here's this series that we're in, we're calling it Influencer. And today is kind of the For You page, right? The For You section, right, to say, hey, there's kind of this profound dual thing in the book of Ephesians and in the gospel message overall, that you are not rescued, you are not loved because you have an impressive resume that wowed God and wowed the people around you. Like God knows the big ugly thing that you spend a lot of your life trying to make sure people don't know. That's not a mystery to God, and yet God, through Jesus, moved toward you, extended an invitation to the feast that we've spent the past couple of weeks talking about. But that some of the best way that shows up and sorts itself out in a time like ours is how that grace and mercy is playing out in the stories of the people who receive it. Laura Sisko talks about this. She's got an article, it's in your notes, called A Pre-Political Psychology, where she goes, hey, in the moment with which we live, one of the things we can look around us, it's not hard to find, is people who are kind of going about their business, partisan leanings and all, and like kind of cherry picking some scriptures to kind of prop themselves up as the right and true version of whatever the solutions are in a place like ours, in a country like ours, in a world like ours. And she's like, what the Church of Jesus Christ needs to do differently is to embrace this pre-political psychology. Like, in other words, rather than just let me find a couple of verses that prop my partisan leanings or the way I think the world should work, if I put myself in the position of understanding how I've been loved by God, and if I put myself around people that will help me understand how I've been loved by God, and we begin as God's people to operate out of that, what we offer is a differentiated place of love amongst a whole lot of noise that actually calls itself loving. Easier said than done, to be sure. John chapter 4 is this interesting moment where the invitation to participate in that kind of reality expresses itself. John 4 goes like this. There's this, Jesus is, according to John, in a position where he has to go through Samaria. This is page 742 in those green Bibles in front of you. The whole chapter, I'm going to have to summarize about 38 verses in about 2 minutes. But I'm going to get to kind of the core of the story, right? So Jesus has to go through Samaria, not because it's a one-way street, not because there's these natural, like, nature, you can't go over the mountains, you got to go through the mines of Moria to get to wherever you're going, right? Like, the have to go is like a compelling, like, I'm going to go places that other Jewish leaders won't go. Well, why won't they go through Samaria? Well, because they think the people there are unclean. There's actually a lot of ethnic tension and hatred towards the Samaritans because, to speak Harry Potter language, they're kind of mudbloods. They're kind of Jewish, but they're not Jewish, and that's a real problem for Jewish people. So most people dodge Samaria. They don't go there. Jesus has to go there. And he goes there and he stops at a well. It's noon. The disciples go get food. Like what a group of guys will do in the middle of the day. Like, we should probably eat. We don't know what else to do. And Jesus goes to this well. He meets and interacts with a woman at noon, which is a strange place because women that would draw from the well would often do that in the morning, both because of the temperature of the water by the middle of the day, but also just the practical needs of like a household, right? If you're going to gather water, you go in the morning and you use it kind of throughout the day. So there's a woman there kind of showing up at this unconventional time, and Jesus and her begin to exchange pleasantries. She's aware that he's a rabbi. She's aware that he's got some things to say, and they begin to engage one another out of this conversation about, like, can I have a drink? You can find this in John chapter 4, right? And the conversation intensifies to a place of kind of theological banter. Like, what is this living water, and what's it a shadow of? And Jesus kind of ascertains that, like, she's actually kind of knows her stuff, right? Like if you knew the gift of God, then you would ask me for water. Sir, give me this water that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. Like I want this living water you're talking about. I know these other things that you're alerting to. So Jesus says in verse 16, go call your husband and come back. Now it gets weird. She says, I have no husband. Verse 17, And Jesus goes, yeah, you're right when you say you have no husband. In fact, you've had 5 husbands. The man that you now have is not your husband. What you've said is just true. Now, 2025 language, that is like shame, right? That's like shame, like, oh, I've heard about you, gold digger, right? Or whatever colloquial term we want to apply to someone we think is of ill repute. But what's probably, if we project that onto the first century, though, we'll miss a little bit of the thing that's probably more true, which is to be a first century woman, having had 5 husbands and now living with someone who's not her husband, is probably not happened fully out of her own volition, because she cannot go down to City Hall and go, hey, I want to leave him and I'm going to take my 50% and move on. She doesn't have those kind of rights. So how does she have 5 husbands and live with a guy that's not her husband? Probably some combo platter of divorce and death. And the divorce, by the way, is it going to be initiated by the man? So there's a sullied reputation here, to be sure. This is a woman people are whispering about, to be sure. Jesus, though, is trying to show that he's not just a good teacher that has some things to say about the world, that he knows her station and is still interacting with her. She goes, I know, I can see that you're a prophet, right? They continue to talk. The woman says, I know that when the Messiah called Christ is coming, when he comes, he will explain everything to us. This is her way of like, this conversation got awkward and I don't know how to get out of it. Jesus says, I, the one speaking to you, am he. And then here come the disciples making noise. The disciples return and were surprised to find him talking with a woman, but no one asked, what do you want, or why are you talking with her? The conversation in their mind, like, hey, we just rescued Jesus from maybe a weird thing, but we don't want to talk about that. And they begin, the next couple of verses tell us that they get really fixated on whether or not Jesus has had some food. While that's happening, what does the woman do? The woman leaves her water jar, goes back to the town, and says to the people, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? They came out of the town and made their way toward him. Meanwhile, the disciples urged him, Rabbi, eat something. I want us to jump down to verse 38. Verse 39 rather, speaks to what happens next, right? Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him being Jesus, because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed for 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. Did you catch that? That the way something cool happens in Samaria, this place that Jesus has to go, happens in like an unscripted, unplanned moment where Jesus is bringing the fullness of his presence into the story of a person who's looking and longing for such a thing, and then goes into town to the very people that probably whisper about her and talk about her and say things about her, and goes, hey, you got to come to this well, because I tell you a story about a person who told me everything I ever did. Why am I sharing this with you? Why did we jump from Ephesus to John? Here at the Foundry, we don't tend to do that. We tend to linger over one passage. It's like, because it's important, I think, for us to grasp that some of the best ways that God is going to work in whatever Samarias you kind of have to enter, whether it's by obligation or by a sense of calling, is going to happen because of the overflow of the thing that God is stirring in your story. And the way God worked in Samaria was not through a 37-point lecture or a bunch of cool tools and memes and YouTube links and lectures and books to read, but the overflowing of how God's grace is interacting with someone's story. What if this good news isn't just something for you and sort of like sorting out the pressures and the burdens that you have to face, but what if it's also something that that God wants to do through you. Like God has a mission for you, and it's not just like, should I go to Ireland? Should I marry this girl? Should I buy this house? Should I worship at this church? But it's to operate out of the overflow of what God is doing in our story in the places that we inhabit. And that place is some of the most critical and important work that God is going to do in Baltimore this week, that God is going to do in the region this week, that God is going to do, like the way you are interacting with intentionality, the way that you are letting the love of God speak into your story, and the way that you're operating out of it. One of the things we're going to do over these next couple of weeks is like just share stories of like how some of the people in this room have been impacted by like the good news of Jesus, how that like arrived upon our ears. I didn't really want to go to church. I wasn't really into it, but my family kind of thought, hey, you're a teenager, and we should probably get you around some people that are thinking about big things, because we noticed that you've got big feelings as a teenager. Okay, fine. Table that for a second. I need to tell you one other detail that would make sense in this story. When I was thinking about this story initially, the past couple of weeks ago, I did so because I got asked this question: what do you do for a living? You know, some version of that. Now, for you, if you like work for a foundation or you do something cool, it's usually a question that like leads to other interesting banter. Like, oh, tell me more about your attempt to cure cancer. Tell me more about like what it's like to be a teacher. Oh, you're staying home right now. That's super cool. Sometimes when you say I'm a pastor, like the conversation just gets weird or it stops. So I was having some version, like a fire pit version of that very conversation. And it wasn't like, what do you do for a living? It was like, so I know what you do for a living. Yeah, okay, check. Are you serious about that? To their credit, they're just trying to like move a little closer. Like, I don't understand this. Like, why one would do this for a living. And so I'm kind of curious if you're like mailing it in for the next 20 years or you just got roped into this somehow. And then the follow-up, the last question is like, well, why? Why would you be serious about this? And it was this moment. Like this goes back, if I go back to my origin story as like an angsty teenager whose parents are making them go to church because like they want to like get themselves back plugged into those things themselves. It was rooted in a community of people that were wrestling with these big ideas about how the world works, what our purpose, what our meaning was, like wrestling with kind of the John O'Donohue language, like the lowlands of all that fruitless, like meh, partial fulfillment, complacency, that there was a group of people that were creating space for a 15, 16-year-old boy to be like angsty and to be confused and to not know if he had purpose and to answer his questions and to be excited to see him. And I told the person at this fire, like, that was transformational to me, and I guess at my core, what I think about the work I do is like, on its best day, that's what we're trying to do for people. Like, to be a community of people that are trying to help people plug into those big questions about purpose and redirect it. But that was birthed out of, like, not my resume, not my talents, but like a thing God is doing in my own story. And a thing 30 years later, God is continuing to do in my story. How does the love of God show up? What does it mean to be God's handiwork, not as an angsty teenager, but as an angsty middle-aged man? What does it mean to live into this invitation, to be free from the lowlands of complacency and partial fulfillment in a world where it feels like all that gets rewarded is complacency and partial fulfillment? Because To otherwise live would be to be unfulfilled or angsty. Letting the love of God dwell in us richly, and letting that send us back to the spaces that we inhabit, not having it all figured out, but trying to sort it out in the context of community, is at our core what it means to be a church of individuals and people unlearning, learning, and relearning what it means to see ourselves through the lens of God's grace and through the lens of God's handiwork. And what something like communion is intended to do, just like singing worship songs or hearing from the scriptures, is to both comfort and challenge us in the place of our status quo. The status quo of your life might be the lowlands of complacency and partial fulfillment. It might be that you've felt like you were thrown in the rubbish bin, or that you just jumped in the rubbish bin of life and you made a mess of things yourself. But that the good news is that the grace and mercy of Jesus met you and is working in you and is helping you live into the unforced rhythms of God's grace. Communion is an act of rebellion against those other forces, of formation. It's a way to say, Lord, help me to carry properly who I am in relation to who you are and what you've done. So may we receive that invitation today. If we're not a follower of Jesus, may we continue to ask good questions about how the love of God is greater than a list of rules to follow or a series of behaviors to adhere to. But if we are a follower of Jesus and your life looks anything like mine, may you be reminded about the love of God's desire to dwell in you richly, to be present with you, and to free you from the lowlands of complacency and partial fulfillment. To take communion is to receive that invitation today and let it wash over your story, wherever you are. To let the love of God continue to work and move. And to let that be some of how God is going to do some of God's best works in a time of hopelessness, in a time of anxiety, in a time of uncertainty. Let's pray together as we aim to receive this. Lord, my default settings are to believe that you love me because I do things for you. My default settings would be to, if I show the best version of myself, that you would welcome me as your son. Lord, you've called me into something much more robust, something much more beautiful, something so much more comprehensive. Lord, there are those of us in this room who feel the burden of our moment so deeply. And it feels like a waste of time to center ourselves in this way because there's so much work to be done. Lord, would you remind us that to live in this differentiated version of ourselves, to be free from the anxiety and the hopelessness of the lowlands of complacency and partial fulfillment, is one way in which you are going to work and move in the lives of other people. So, Lord, before we can extend it, help us to really receive it, to receive it today. For the first time or for the 100th time, but with a new way to think about it. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your grace. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.